Well, we're going to go to the wider Q&A.
Okay, can I have a look at the what's on Slido, which we haven't dealt with? Okay. Well, one of the questions, in addition to expediting the regulatory processes, what other measures can be taken to manage the increasing demand in healthcare? It's an interesting question, and there's potential for an awful lot of answers to that one. Sorry, you probably can't see, I'm afraid you can't see it. Okay, in addition to expediting regulatory processes, what other measures can be taken to manage the increasing demand in healthcare? Anybody like to kick off with that one? It is. All right, let's. Is anybody going to say it?
Michael is.
Michael's going to say something. Good, he's got some policy background.
Controversial, but maybe people could take responsibility for their own health a bit more.
Can I just throw something in, which is related to regulatory processes, which is innovation. Healthcare delivery is the only area, in my experience, in industry, if you've got a performance problem, you look to innovation technology to get you out of that particular performance hole generally. Healthcare is the only sector, in my experience, where that's very patchy. In fact, the management generally try to avoid innovation in many respects in terms of operational stuff because of the budgetary challenges. So the big challenge for me is how do you get innovation into the system and effectively used and valued. So, sorry, that's my personal view. Okay. Question? Sorry. Yeah.
Good podcast with Alan Dilber.
Right.
Talking to Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, and they talk about often health is seen as an illness service or wellness service.
Yeah.
And they say that's the biggest challenge politically to get that across. At least, polite way of saying what you're saying, Michael, really.
Right.
In terms of demand, biggest spends we have in the NHS probably we spend 20 billion a year on treating diabetics. We spend about 30 billion a year on treating signs and causes of dementia. So the other big spend as well, which links into the sort of diabetes side, is the obesity space. And that's something that we can do things with, and you started to see some of the treatments coming through with Wegovy and Ozempic and some of those areas on obesity. If you can address obesity, you can address things like diabetes, end-stage renal disease, cardiovascular, and you can do. I think we're going to see a lot of work in that space in the next 12, 24 months.
Right. Okay, can we have a look at the other questions? What's left? NHS and private healthcare issues should arise for issues that arise for networking of medical devices into existing system that causes problems, responsibility, post-installation between estate. Oh, cracky, this is a big. Yeah, I guess this comes down to the issue about integrating medical devices into complex hospital systems, and how do you manage that in a more effective way? I think it's probably what the question is with the various stakeholders in the system. Sorry, we can't get them up in front of you, I'm sorry. No. It was the top one. It was about, oh, sorry, yeah.
Can you hear me? The top one, NHS private healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a few developments in standards now around, firstly, interoperability. So looking at how devices actually work with each other in a networked environment. But the second one is also the data transfer protocols have been developed now as well. So we've been speaking about pulse oximetry today, for example. If you look at how pulse oximeters communicate and provide data and present data, then there are now standards developed around those communication protocols as well to ensure that we do have better interoperability between the devices and any systems that are sort of receiving information from those devices, but also the transfer protocols and the language that is actually generated so that we can do better things like sort of analyse the data science, etc., etc.
Yeah. Okay. Right, let's switch on to, are we ready for digital pharmacy?
That's a very interesting question, actually. Is one I concerned myself with a little while ago when we were kind of exploring what the medical world meant to us at digital engineering. And I suppose it depends what you mean by digital pharmacy and whether that's in drug discovery or drug development. And there's a lot of really interesting research going on at the moment using digital tools to aid in exactly that. It's something that we don't do because it uses, the kind of areas of science that we're mostly not involved in, but it's definitely something that companies are doing at the moment. One of the areas that we do sort of try to operate in is in the manufacturing side of things. So, a lot of the challenges involved in manufacturing pharmaceuticals are often the same in food, and there's a lot of overlap there, which is really interesting. So, yeah, when we're looking at digital pharmacy, I mean, there's also the area of doing trials on patients, which is very much the sort of cutting edge, and that's where you'll hear this sort of digital twin of the human body, that kind of terminology coming up, and we actually work with a consortium called CompBiomed, and who are focused very much on this exact problem and how we can create the digital human and look to run kind of in silico trials, as your colleague Marco Visconti is familiar with that kind of area, and it's something that we're not too involved in. It's really kind of cutting edge and yeah, an exciting area, and I think we'll see some developments there in a few years.
I'm guessing there's an expertise issue as well. That's always the problem with new technologies, isn't it? It's not the producers, it's the people receiving the technology that have to have the expertise to use it effectively. UK government often talks about AI as an area of UK might be globally leading. Funders have invested a lot. What can regulators do to put some structure into how AI-powered devices gets safely into patients or safely to patients?
Shall I answer that?
Yeah, I'm looking for volunteers.
I think it's really interesting. We're seeing this now in Europe. So we're learning about how implementation can go badly. So we sort of change the regulation, we change the regulator, we change the regulated regulation, and all the other bits and pieces, the notified bodies around it. And we do it all in one big, let's just do it all in one, rather than sort of phased. We put lots of additional new requirements in. I think it said 50 pages to 500 pages or something earlier.
Yeah, something like that.
Basically, don't try and create regulations that are actually already being discussed in standards and essential requirements. Don't try and create a whole series of, new regulatory burdens on trustworthiness, on explainability, on how do you mathematically demonstrate performance in a probabilistic model or something like that. Don't get into the weeds, because you've got a shed load of standards committees internationally, experienced people sitting down in things like ART1 in BSI right now, trying to resolve those. Some of the cleverest of the clever people actually dealing with that. Don't then, as a regulator, start to try and create those new rules, actually embrace them and enable them so that people can be aware that those standards and requirements will be part of the new regulation, and then speed them up.
Yeah. Not reinventing the wheel. Yeah, okay. One's disappeared off my screen, which was, when should SMEs start a PMCF trial, which I thought was actually quite a specific and useful question.
Hello?
It's not there. It's just, oh, it is there. Sorry. Yeah. When should a SME consider starting their PMCF study?
Let me try to start. If your product in question has actually the final job conclusion coming from your device in question, identify some lags, gaps, and if the intended purpose or indication or contraindication have been not in line with the regulation GSPRs, you will be definitely required to initiate PMCF study. There are so many points. Another point will be if there is an unforeseen or major concerns initiated from PMS activity, PMS plan, or your complaints, there will be another option that you will be probably challenged by notified body or asked to advise, to answer, to address those gaps. Otherwise, you need to initiate PMCF study and to demonstrate how actually can you measure such concerns, and what will be the next step that you actually should not be, let's say, challenged in the next future.
Okay, thank you.
In addition to that, there are actually so many points, because the PMCF activity means everything will be controlled on your device in question during life cycles. In every risk-benefit ratio is another point that you need to control during life cycle, during preparation of CR, or also during your PMS activity. It can be customer complaints, it can be complaints on your device in question, it can be surgery complaints on device or user, whatever. You just need to make sure that everything is addressed and to avoid, otherwise you are also required to initiate PMCF plan that will probably show if there is any need to initiate PMCF activity or not.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Right, some medical devices are now being developed and de-risked in the academic environment where there is little understanding of the regulations. What advice would you give to academics working in this space?
So I think we had this one
We did.
earlier. I'd argue some academic institutions actually have pretty good understanding, but there's perhaps more that can be done. As I said, there are certainly at a very early stage. It's just understanding the basics, the foundations, and then once you've worked out it's got legs, then spend some time doing all the activities that James pointed out. But from an academic perspective, Professor Lewis.
The poison chalice. I think we talked before as well about using the MedTech innovation collaboratives.
Yeah.
There's a point of reference. If you're an academic, you can go there and use them. They'll give you some good regulatory advice. I think academics, I'm going to put my academic hat on. Academics are more interested generally in how to do a spin out and how much equity they're going to get out of it than the regulatory strategy to start off with. That comes afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Right, what else can we do? How is Element full test suite for home? Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, there's a question above it which is devices and home use as well. Maybe we could link the two together. You could do the bottom,
I'll try.
And we could talk about moving devices into the home environment and what the implications of that are. So, but I'll let you go first. Yeah.
In fact, I can join the stage.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the one at the bottom here, how are Element positioned to support the testing of products for home use and uncontrolled? Well, we have UCAS accreditation and CB accreditation to undertake full testing regardless of the three locations in respect to EMC and safety testing. So actually very well positioned. We can undertake the relevant testing required in respect to product safety and EMC for global markets. And then in regards to the home, I don't have any specific advice other than the fact that for EMC testing and safety testing with EMC testing there is the test levels are more onerous. So often you can, if you've previously tested for the least onerous levels, then you can visually sort of see in regards to what's been tested previously. You can look at your results and you already have an indication of whether you've met those requirements or not. And in fact, there may not be a need for repeating that EMC testing if your testing previously sort of met those limits, even though those limits weren't applied. With regards to safety testing, there is additional standards to apply. I think it's -1, -11. Lee, I'm looking at you to confirm. So yeah, it's an additional safety standard that would need to be applied. Not much you can really do to prepare for that, other than having a look at the standard and be aware of those requirements. But ultimately, we'd need to test to determine those requirements are being met.
Yeah, the second question is quite interesting about from clinicians' perspective,
Yeah.
moving. And I guess I'm guessing the questions they've got to ask is, was it designed to be used in the home? Number one.
I think what we're seeing at the moment with moving.
Yeah.
Michael was explaining this about some of the sort of cath lab activities where, you might be there for 7 days and we want to discharge you and get you in, get you into the home. And what we're going to do is give you a smartwatch and a few other bits and pieces. But what you have to be very, very cognizant of is that clinical benefit is based around the clinical standard of care. So if you don't know what the clinical standard of care is, we noticed this in orthopedics, for example, that okay, when you go to a private hospital, you would think that you're going to get the best care in the world, but you will if the routine operation that you've gone in for goes well. But then it's a little bit pot luck that if you, for example, have a heart attack or if something happens that is a little bit left of field, the clinical standard of care has now changed dramatically. So whilst you might be saying, Laura, you know what we'll do? We'll stop the waiting list in the hospitals by getting them out, put them in the home, do some monitoring, that life's going to be great. But just remember what the entire clinical standard of care that revolved around those patients was before. And is you actively making medical devices now that can be used in the home impacting that standard of care? And a lot of the work that you can do is go to your risk analyses, have a look at the risks that may occur in terms of, those unintended events, what the severity and harm would be, and look at the mitigations. And many of those mitigations are around very qualified clinicians with incredibly high value equipment able to sort of rush to your aid should you suffer from some of these things, whereas now you're in the home and all you might have is the dog. Hopefully it can do CPR.
Just to kind of add on to that, I think there's also kind of the theory's great, but in practices there's sort of a capacity, a cultural sort of challenges as well with the implementation of sort of remote services. So when this one time when I worked in industry with pacemakers and ICDs, we had remote patient management with those products, which is great. So rather than a patient coming in every 3 months or every 6 months for a follow-up, they'd have a remote monitor at home that could download any sort of clinically relevant events or any sort of serious adverse events that had happened to the device. Great. Problem is then, in terms of the service, suddenly hospitals had to think around, well, what do we do with this? Who's going to look at this data? How often do we look at this data? What happens if something comes in at 6:10 and they've gone home at 6? What do we do? Do we get reimbursed for this? So actually, there's lots of sort of and trust as well. Do you trust this? Is this just about sort of not seeing patients, or do you trust the information you're being given? So there's often a lot of other factors that need to kind of really be considered, and that service development piece is really critical, along with the cultural side of things, to actually get the benefits of these technologies. Because again, quite a few times in a former life, people would pitch ideas and they'd be like, and it does this thing remotely, and then it downloads the data to a GP, and you're like, well, does the GP know that? Is the GP going to log on and look at that thing? They're maxed out anyway. Do they want to look at that? Is that so? I think that's where the PPI bit comes in. It's really, really key, and understanding obviously the gold standard. So there's sort of cultural and capability bits as well.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just add as well?
Yeah.
If you're moving from hospital to home, you've got to remember always patient safety, and always remember who's going to be using your product. Using an infusion pump in a hospital is one thing, but having an 80-year-old using an infusion pump whilst watching Bargain Hunt at 12:30 is something completely different. So you have to consider things like usability studies particularly, and always consider that change in patient population is a significant change to the way that your product's being used. So always speak to your conformity assessment body about it.
Right, we are running up against the clock. So I'm actually going to hand over to Nicole to just close proceedings. But thanks to everybody for their engagement. I'll stay there for the moment. I don't think it's going to be terribly long.
Do you have a burning...
Or unless somebody's got a burning
Just
comment.
a question at the bottom it says. So I saw a
It
question
did.
at the bottom. It says, does NIHR support
Yes.
health
Yes.
economic assessment? Yes, as part of FAST grants.
Good, that was easy.
I just want to say thank you to everybody who's come today, as well as listening at home in your offices. I know you've taken time out from very, very busy schedules, and we really appreciate you participating. This has been Element's first dedicated MedTech conference, and I hope you have enjoyed it. But I'd also want to express deep thanks to every speaker as well that's come today just to talk to you as well. So if you can, there is a feedback survey. It's open till I think the 27th of this month. We'd really appreciate your feedback. Be honest, as we talked about candour earlier in my slides, so do be honest. We're really grateful for that constructive information advice. And safe journey home. Thank you ever so much for coming today.